It was the winter of 1944, and the war was at a turning point. On the front lines, the men fought relentlessly, each day a battle for survival in the blood-soaked trenches and snow-covered fields of Europe. Yet back behind the lines, a quieter battle was unfolding, one that many had overlooked or dismissed. The enemy wasn't just on the other side of the battlefield. It was the skepticism and prejudice that permeated the ranks of the Allied forces. At the heart of this was a belief, deeply ingrained, that women, no matter how capable or determined, simply couldn't perform the kind of work needed to keep the war machine running, particularly when it came to tank repairs. The M10 Wolverine, the tank destroyer that would soon become central to the lives of these women, was a mechanical marvel. Its intricate systems, heavy guns, complex engines, tracks designed for the harshest terrain, demanded skill, strength, and precision. It was the kind of work traditionally handled by male mechanics, soldiers who had trained for years, who had honed their craft on the battlefields of Europe. So when 12 women, most of whom had no prior experience in military machinery, were assigned to a tank repair crew, the reactions were less than welcoming. The men who had spent their lives in grease-streaked uniforms were dubious. The generals, locked in their command centers, were even more skeptical. Women in the field, working on tanks? They scoffed. It wasn't that the women didn't have the same patriotism or determination as the men. It was simply that, in the eyes of the military establishment, women were supposed to serve in ways that were considered appropriate for their gender, nursing, communications, or perhaps as secretaries. Repairing tanks, especially under fire, was a man's job. The women were keenly aware of the prejudice. They could feel the cold stares as they arrived at the tank yards. The men's voices dropped to murmurs behind their backs, unsure whether they should even be there, let alone trusted with such critical work. But these women had volunteered, had fought to prove that they were capable just as much as their male counterparts. They had watched their brothers, fathers, and husbands go to war, and now they too were ready to do their part. The only thing they needed was a chance. But would the military give them that chance? Or would they be relegated to the sidelines, stuck in the shadow of doubt? Little did anyone know they would soon rewrite what was thought possible on the battlefield. In those cold, snow-covered yards, the story of the women who would defy the odds and silence their critics was just beginning to unfold. The 12 women stood together, side by side, at the edge of the tank repair yard, their faces a mixture of determination and doubt. They were far from what anyone would have expected, not soldiers by trade, not hardened warriors who'd been battle-tested in the trenches. Instead, they were daughters, mothers, and sisters who had grown up in small towns across America. Some had spent their days in factory assembly lines. Others had worked as school teachers or seamstresses. Yet, despite the varied paths that had led them here, one thing was clear. Each of them had come to the war effort for a reason, driven by a sense of duty, a desire to prove themselves, and the unshakable belief that they were capable of far more than anyone had imagined. Betty Callaway, a 28-year-old engineer from Detroit, had spent her youth fixing old cars with her father. The men at the factory where she worked thought it was strange for a woman to be good with engines. But she had never let their whispers bother her. When the call came for women to join the war effort, she didn't hesitate. She was ready to use her skills for something bigger than herself. The war machine needed repair, and Betty knew how to fix things. Clara Johnson, a 22-year-old farm girl from Oklahoma, had never even seen a tank before enlisting. But her father had taught her how to fix tractors, to mend fences, to do the hard work that men typically handled on the farm. She was tough, resourceful, and willing to learn, even if it meant working alongside soldiers who didn't think she belonged. Doris Langley, a mother of two from a small town in Pennsylvania, had spent her pre-war years running a boarding house. When her husband was drafted, she knew she couldn't just sit at home. She needed to do her part, just as he was. But joining the Army was more than just duty. It was personal. Her brother had been lost in battle in the Pacific, and Doris was determined to contribute in any way she could, no matter the cost. Each woman's background was different, yet they all shared a single motivation: to serve, to show that women had a vital place in the war effort, and to prove that they could perform just as well, if not better, than their male counterparts. As they arrived at the tank yard, the men looked them over with skepticism. They were told to get to work, but no one really expected them to accomplish anything significant. The idea that women could repair tanks, especially under fire, was laughable to many of the soldiers. But these 12 women had seen the same thing in each other, an unspoken bond formed from the knowledge that if they could break through the barriers of doubt and prove their worth, they might change everything. In the beginning, the women faced a mountain of challenges, not just from the enemy, but from the disdain of their own comrades. Yet each woman carried a deep, personal determination. Whether it was the hope of honoring lost loved ones, the chance to rewrite history, or simply the desire to take on a challenge that others believed they couldn't handle, they knew this was their moment to prove that women, too, could fight in their own way. They would soon learn that it wasn't just their hearts that could endure the brutal realities of war, but their hands and minds as well. The women arrived at the tank yard early, the chill of the morning air biting at their faces as they walked toward the giant hulks of damaged tanks awaiting repair. There was no fanfare, no warm welcome, just the cold, practical reality of what lay ahead. The men who had been working in the yard for months eyed them with thinly veiled skepticism, their whispers just loud enough to reach the women's ears. Some of the soldiers seemed amused by the presence of women in this grim, mechanical world. Others were outright dismissive. "Don't expect to do much," one of the men muttered to Clara as she walked past. "These things take more than just a pair of hands." The women, however, were undeterred. They had been trained, though not in the ways most of these men expected. Their training had come from a variety of sources. Some had learned by working in factories, others from hands-on experience at home or in mechanic shops. They were not soldiers, but they were sharp, resourceful, and hungry to prove their worth. Their first assignment, however, was nothing like the high-stakes life-or-death repairs they had imagined. Instead, they were given what the men considered simple tasks: tightening bolts, cleaning grease traps, and replacing minor parts like fuel filters and spark plugs. It was, as Betty Callaway put it, the busy work, tasks that the men felt were beneath them but necessary to keep the tanks operational. At first, it felt like a test of patience. The women, eager to show they were capable of much more, worked swiftly and quietly, focusing on the small details. They worked alongside the men, whose glances and muttered comments reminded them that they were being watched, judged. Some of the men made it clear they didn't think the women could handle anything more complex. and their tone only heightened the sense of isolation. Still, the women held their heads high. They knew that proving themselves would take time, and this, for now, was just the first step. But even in these seemingly insignificant tasks, the women's precision stood out. Clara, who had grown up fixing farm equipment, found herself tightening bolts and adjusting parts with a practiced ease. Doris, ever resourceful, used her nursing background to organize and label the spare parts in the yard, finding a system that made the work more efficient. Betty, who had worked on engines back in Detroit, was meticulous, ensuring every machine she touched was running at its peak. By the end of the day, despite the men's doubts, the women had finished their assignments quickly and flawlessly. The tanks were cleaner, better organized, and more ready for the next round of repairs than before. The men had no choice but to notice, even if they didn't say it aloud. They were starting to see that these women, no matter how much the military had underestimated them, were more than capable. But the real challenge lay ahead, when the tanks needed real urgent repairs, and when the bullets began to fly. And as the women would soon find out, they were about to be tested in ways no one had expected. The day was bleak, the sky heavy with the weight of an impending storm, both in the weather and on the battlefield. The usual hum of the tank yard was suddenly interrupted by the arrival of a new batch of damaged tanks. This time, they were not just lightly wounded or in need of routine maintenance. These tanks were battered and broken, their metal shells scarred from fierce combat. The air was thick with tension as the rumble of distant artillery fire reminded everyone that the war was closing in, and there would be no time to waste. The repair crews scrambled, but there was a problem. The men were few, and many of them had already been dispatched to the front lines to support ongoing operations. What remained was a small group of soldiers and the 12 women who had only recently arrived. The tanks couldn't wait. The war couldn't wait. The front lines were demanding reinforcements, and the supply lines had to be kept open. Every moment of delay meant more soldiers exposed to danger, more lives lost. The problem wasn't just the urgency of the repairs, it was the looming danger that the women had only heard about in passing. The constant threat of enemy fire. The women, who had only previously worked under relatively safe conditions, now found themselves in a terrifying new reality. The men had always worked under the assumption that they had ample time to make repairs in safety. But now, with the battlefield so close, the tanks were under direct threat from German forces. The first tank that rolled in was barely operational. Its turret was jammed, its engine choked with dirt, and its tracks were missing large sections, leaving it useless on the battlefield. The repair team had no choice but to dive into action. The women were given a direct order: fix these tanks now. At first they hesitated. They had trained for this, yes, but not under fire. The sound of artillery and machine gun fire crackled through the air, growing louder as the front lines pressed closer. But there was no time for fear. There was no time to doubt their ability. Clara looked around at the faces of the other women, their eyes wide but determined. They knew what had to be done, and they knew the risks. Without a second thought, Betty Callaway, always the first to act, grabbed a wrench and dashed toward the tank's engine compartment. The others followed, moving with practiced precision. But they weren't just repairing tanks now. They were doing it under enemy fire, with explosions echoing in the distance and the ground trembling with every burst of gunfire. The men watched from a distance, some still unable to believe what they were witnessing. The women worked seamlessly, their hands steady despite the danger, their minds focused on the task at hand. They moved with efficiency and purpose, knowing that every second counted. Doris Langley, usually more reserved, was the first to notice the proximity of the German forces. A tank, barely 300 yards away, was beginning to position itself. Its turret turned slowly, taking aim at the repair yard. Her heart raced, but her hands never faltered. "We need to move," she said urgently, her voice barely above a whisper. The women didn't need further encouragement. They continued to work, more driven than ever, pushing their fear into the background. By the time the tank was ready for action, the repair was complete, just in time. But it wasn't just the repair work that made the difference. It was their refusal to flinch in the face of overwhelming odds. They had completed the impossible. Tanks, once lifeless and shattered, were now ready for battle once again. And as the tank's engine roared to life, the women stood back, silently acknowledging their success, knowing they had just faced their first true test under fire and passed with flying colors. The tank wasn't the only one ready for battle. So were they. The women had proven that they could handle not just tools and machinery, but the harshest realities of war. And in that moment, the men who had doubted them had no choice but to admit it. These women had earned their place on the front lines. By the time the women had repaired their first tanks under fire, the men could no longer deny the undeniable. What had begun as whispered skepticism and outright doubt had been replaced with something else entirely: respect. But as quickly as the tanks rolled out of the repair yard, another, even more urgent test arrived. The morning after the successful repairs, the yard was overwhelmed with activity. Tanks were streaming in from the front lines, some barely able to move, others with bullet holes in their sides and tracks ripped to pieces. The urgency was palpable. The air was thick with the scent of oil, sweat, and the heavy hum of impending battle. These were not routine repairs. These were life-and-death fixes. Damage that, if left untreated, could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe for the Allied forces. The men, now forced to confront the capabilities of the women, began to give them more responsibility. But they still kept their distance, never fully trusting that these women, these outsiders, could handle the weight of what was to come. Then came the order that would change everything. A convoy of tanks had been struck hard by enemy fire and was stranded just a few miles from the front lines, vulnerable to another attack. The repair crews were called to action. The tanks had to be ready within hours, or the soldiers relying on those tanks would be left exposed, easy targets for the Germans. No one else was available to fix them. Not without risking another attack or wasting valuable time. It was in this moment, amid the chaos and pressure, that the women's skills and their resolve shone brighter than ever. Betty, who had previously worked in a car factory, took charge of organizing the repairs. She quickly assessed each tank, knowing exactly what parts were needed and which repairs could be done in the limited time they had. Clara, with her calm, steady nature, began coordinating the crew, assigning specific tasks to each of the women. She even started directing a few of the men who were now looking at her for guidance, their previous doubts all but erased. Doris, ever resourceful, became the lifeline between the repair team and the command center, negotiating for extra parts and keeping them supplied with everything they needed. The team, now operating like a well-oiled machine, worked with an urgency that few could have matched. For the first time, the men stopped watching them from the sidelines. Instead, they began offering help where they could, lifting heavy parts and assisting with tasks they knew would take too long for the women to handle alone. There were still those who held reservations, still those who believed this couldn't possibly work. But their skepticism was quieted by the women's unrelenting work ethic. They were no longer outsiders. They were integral to the operation. When the last tank roared to life and the convoy was ready to roll out, the entire repair yard fell silent. It wasn't just the work that stood out. It was the fact that these women had done what no one thought they could. They had turned a hopeless situation into a strategic victory. They had fixed the tanks in record time, under fire, and without hesitation. The word spread quickly. These women were no longer just mechanics. They were warriors in their own right. The men who had doubted them were now offering their respect, some even sheepishly admitting they never expected the repairs to be completed, let alone done so flawlessly. The women had proven once and for all that their place was not just in the repair yard, but on the battlefield. The women didn't just prove they could fix tanks. They proved they could face war head-on, under the worst conditions, and come out victorious. Their moment of doubt had passed. Now, they were the ones leading the charge, quietly, without fanfare, but with a determination that would forever change the perception of what women could achieve in wartime. The tank repair yard was quieter now, the frantic buzz of activity replaced by a strange stillness. The roar of the tanks and the hammering of tools had faded, but the reverberations of what had just occurred would be felt for a long time to come. The women stood in the aftermath, their hands still trembling from the intensity of the work, their eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. They had done what many thought impossible. They had repaired the tanks under fire in record time and saved the soldiers depending on them. But while their success was undeniable, the reality of war was that victory didn't always come with celebration. The repair yard had cleared out, but the higher-ups were making their way in. Word of the women's extraordinary success had reached command, and an investigation was about to begin. Though the tanks were now operational, the manner in which they had been repaired, without permission, without clearance, was a breach of military protocol that couldn't be ignored. There were rules, and rules had to be followed, no matter the outcome. The commanding officer, Captain Langston, who had witnessed the repairs firsthand, was torn. He had seen the women work, had seen the results. He couldn't deny their ingenuity or their skill, but at the same time, their disobedience hung over them like a shadow. The order had been clear: wait for permission, observe the enemy, but never act without confirmation. And yet these women had acted anyway, taking matters into their own hands. The morning after the tanks had been repaired and sent back to the front, Langston gathered the women in a small, dimly lit office. The smell of smoke still clung to their clothes, the remnants of the battlefield fresh in their memories. The silence in the room was palpable. No one spoke, but everyone knew what was coming. Langston began by outlining what had transpired. The tanks had been repaired successfully, the convoy had been saved, and the mission had been completed. But then he added the inevitable. "You all acted without orders," he said, his voice steady, but filled with the weight of what he had to say. "You know that's a serious breach." The women looked at each other, their faces a mix of fear, guilt, and resolve. None of them had doubted their actions in the moment. They had done what had to be done. The decision to act had been calculated, precise, and driven by a shared understanding of the stakes. But the consequences of their decision were still unclear. Langston paused, his gaze fixed on Betty, the unspoken leader of the group. "I should report this," he said, his words hanging in the air, but then he sighed and looked at each of them again. "But I can't in good conscience say that you didn't do exactly what needed to be done. You saved lives." The investigation continued, though it never fully reached the severity Langston had feared. The higher-ups, despite their initial push for disciplinary action, found themselves with little leverage. No official orders had been given. There was no clear record that they had been received. The lines of communication had been compromised by the ongoing battle, and the tank repair crew had acted out of sheer necessity. The story they told was backed up by the men who had witnessed the repairs, though their testimonies were carefully controlled. The women had done nothing but fulfill their role as soldiers in the best way they knew how, with precision, intelligence, and determination. The women did not receive a medal for their actions, not at first. No one patted them on the back, and the traditional accolades for heroism were never offered. Instead, Langston passed along the message from higher command: "We'll be watching your work." The phrase was a mix of warning and approval, a recognition that something had changed. The real reward, however, came from an unexpected source. When the scouts from the 1001st Airborne arrived 2 days later, their faces pale from sleepless nights and exposure to the front lines, they were stunned by the sight of the wreckage. The convoy of German tanks, once poised to strike, lay in ruin. "Which unit did this?" they asked, their voices filled with awe. Langston hesitated for a moment, then replied, "It wasn't a unit. It was one gunner." And so, the legend of the 12 women began to spread. The stories told around the campfires, in the mess halls, and through the radio channels grew more fantastical with each retelling. By the time the official investigation wrapped up, the women's work was already becoming a part of military lore. They had done the impossible. They had not only saved the day, they had shattered the notion that women were incapable of performing under fire. Though they never received the medals they deserved, the women's legacy was far from forgotten. In time, their actions were studied, their repair techniques were analyzed, and their unorthodox approach to warfare, taking the initiative when no one else could, was woven into the fabric of military doctrine. Their decision to act, to trust their instincts over military protocol, had saved lives and proven that sometimes, in war, it wasn't the rules that mattered most. It was knowing when to break them. As the war continued, the women who had once been underappreciated and underestimated were forever changed by the events of that winter. The tanks they had repaired, the lives they had saved, and the risks they had taken would echo through their stories long after the final shots were fired. Yet, for all the immediate recognition that came their way, faint though it was, they knew that true victory wasn't just about being noticed in the heat of battle. It was about what they had proven to themselves, to the men who had doubted them, and to future generations of women who would follow in their footsteps. In the months that followed, the women returned to their duties, their roles cemented not only as essential members of the repair crew, but also as symbols of what could be accomplished when courage met opportunity. The tanks continued to roll out of the yard, some fixed with little more than a scrape, others undergoing complicated repairs in the heat of battle. But the repairs weren't just mechanical now. They were personal, as each woman understood the power of their actions. They no longer had to prove their worth to anyone. They had done that with sweat, blood, and the steady hum of an engine in the background. Clara, whose calm demeanor had kept the crew steady under fire, would later become a mentor to other women who joined the ranks. Betty, ever the pragmatic leader, worked quietly behind the scenes to ensure the repair yard ran smoothly, using her knowledge of machines to teach others how to perform complex repairs. And Doris, the motherly figure of the group, made sure to keep morale high, even in the darkest hours, reminding everyone of their duty and the importance of what they had accomplished together. Yet it was the impact on the wider military structure that would ultimately be the most significant. In the years that followed, their unconventional tactics, particularly the repair strategies they employed under fire, began to be integrated into military doctrine. The theory of asymmetrical engagement sequencing, which focused on precise methodical targeting and disabling of enemy vehicles, was officially adopted and taught at training camps. What had once been seen as a reckless gamble had now become an invaluable lesson in battlefield strategy. The women had not only changed the course of the war in that one instance, but had also influenced the way future battles would be fought. But despite all this, the women's legacy was not one of medals or public ceremonies. In the quiet aftermath, many of them returned to their civilian lives, their experiences largely uncelebrated. They went home to small towns and modest lives, where their contributions were often spoken of in whispers, if at all. For some, the war had left scars, physical and emotional, that would take years to heal. Yet for others, the war had offered them a rare chance to break free from the constraints of what society had expected of them. They had proven that, in the face of adversity, they were not defined by their gender or the roles assigned to them by tradition. Raymond Thompson, the gunnery expert who had fired the first shot that changed everything, would later describe the women as the true heroes. They didn't seek glory or fame, he said. They just did their jobs with precision and care, without ever asking for credit. And so, though their names would not be engraved in the history books the way the men's names were, the women who repaired tanks under fire had left a legacy far deeper than any award or recognition could offer. They had shattered an old belief that women couldn't do the hard, gritty work of war, and replaced it with a new truth. Women had the strength, skill, and courage to do anything, even under the most harrowing of circumstances. Their contribution was a quiet revolution, one that would echo in the lives of future generations, inspiring those who would never know their names, but who would find strength in the knowledge that sometimes real heroism comes not from following orders, but from having the courage to break them when necessary.